Margaret Ellis adjusted her worn cardigan as she entered Fitzgerald's fine jewellery, feeling immediately out of place among the gleaming glass cases and polished marble floors. The sales associates, impeccably dressed in tailored suits, barely glanced her way as she timidly approached a display of engagement rings. At 52, with her greying hair pulled back in a simple bun and wearing practical clothes that spoke of a modest income, Margaret was used to being overlooked. But today was different. Today marked her 30th wedding anniversary with Robert, and she had finally saved enough from her elementary school teaching salary to replace the tiny cubic zirconia he had given her when they were just starting out. "Excuse me," she said softly to a young saleswoman who was arranging a display of diamond bracelets. The woman looked up briefly, her eyes traveling over Margaret's unfashionable outfit, before muttering something about being with her in a moment, and turning away to assist a well-dressed couple who had just entered. Margaret waited patiently, studying the rings beneath the glass. Each one represented a different life, a different story. Some were ostentatious, with diamonds so large they seemed almost vulgar. Others were delicate and refined, speaking of quiet elegance. She wondered which one would best represent the life she and Robert had built together. 30 years of bills and sacrifices, 2 wonderful children now in college, and a love that had weathered every storm. "Are you finding everything all right?" A deep voice startled her from her reverie. An older gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes stood before her, his name tag identifying him as Thomas, Senior Sales Director. "I'm just looking at engagement rings," Margaret replied, self-consciousness making her voice even quieter. "For my anniversary." Something in Thomas's expression shifted. Unlike his colleagues, he pulled out a stool. "Please, sit down. Tell me about this anniversary." Perhaps it was his genuine interest, or maybe just the relief of finally being acknowledged, but Margaret found herself sharing her story. She told him about Robert, a maintenance supervisor at the local hospital, who worked extra shifts to put their children through college. She described their early years in a 1-bedroom apartment, saving pennies for their modest home, and she explained her dream of finally replacing her original ring with something that sparkled like the diamond Robert had always promised her. Someday. "We've finally reached someday," she concluded with a smile. "I've saved $2,500. I know it's not much for this store, but it's a beautiful someday," Thomas interrupted gently. He reached beneath the counter and brought out a tray of rings that was simpler than those on display, but still lovely. "These might be within your range." As Margaret tried on several rings, she became aware of a commotion near the store's entrance. A crowd of sales associates had gathered around a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit who had just arrived. His commanding presence seemed to transform the atmosphere of the entire store. "Who is that?" Margaret asked Thomas curiously. "Alexander Reynolds," Thomas replied, his voice lowered. "One of the wealthiest property developers in the city. He comes in a few times a year to buy pieces for his wife." Margaret nodded, turning her attention back to a small but brilliant diamond that had caught her eye. It was slightly above her budget, but Thomas assured her he could offer a special anniversary discount. Meanwhile, Mr. Reynolds was being escorted through the store by the manager himself, examining various pieces, but seeming dissatisfied with everything presented to him. His voice carried across the store. "I need something extraordinary. It's our 30th anniversary tomorrow." Margaret smiled at the coincidence as she finalized her purchase with Thomas. The small diamond wasn't extravagant, but it represented decades of love and commitment. As Thomas was processing her payment, the bell above the door chimed again, and Margaret glanced up to see a familiar figure entering the store. Robert. Her husband of 30 years stood in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically nervous in his best suit, the one he only wore to weddings and funerals. His eyes found hers immediately, widening in surprise. "Margaret? What are you doing here?" he asked, approaching her with confusion written across his weathered face. Before she could respond, the store manager intercepted Robert, clearly mistaking him for another customer. "Sir, I'll be with you shortly. I'm currently assisting Mr. Reynolds with a—" "I'm looking for Alexander Reynolds," Robert interrupted, his voice firm but respectful. "I have an appointment." The manager's demeanor changed instantly. "Of course, sir. Mr. Reynolds is right this way." Margaret watched in bewilderment as her husband was led directly to the wealthy developer. The two men shook hands warmly, exchanging words she couldn't quite hear. What could Robert possibly have to do with Alexander Reynolds? Thomas finished boxing her new ring, just as Robert and Mr. Reynolds approached their counter. The wealthy man nodded respectfully to Thomas before turning his full attention to Margaret. "Mrs. Ellis," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Your husband has told me so much about you. I understand we share an anniversary day, 30 years tomorrow, correct?" Margaret stared at Alexander Reynolds in shock, her mind racing to make sense of the connection between this wealthy businessman and her husband. Robert stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Maggie, I've been meaning to tell you," Robert began, his voice trembling slightly. "I've been working with Mr. Reynolds for the past 6 months." "Working with him?" Margaret repeated, bewildered. Alexander Reynolds smiled warmly. "Your husband is being modest, Mrs. Ellis. He's been instrumental in transforming the old community center. When the heating system failed in winter, he not only fixed it, but redesigned the entire system to be more efficient and cost-effective. He saved my foundation thousands of dollars and kept hundreds of children warm." Thomas discreetly slid Margaret's small diamond ring box toward her, but Robert noticed the transaction. His eyes widened with understanding, then softened with emotion. "Maggie, did you buy yourself an anniversary ring?" he asked, his voice thick. Margaret nodded, feeling suddenly embarrassed. "I wanted to surprise you. After 30 years with my little cubic zirconia, I thought—" Robert's weathered hands enveloped hers. "I've been wanting to replace that ring since the day I put it on your finger. You deserved so much better." "It was always perfect," Margaret whispered, tears threatening to spill. "It represented us, modest but strong." Alexander cleared his throat politely. "Robert, shall we proceed with what you came for?" Robert nodded and turned to the store manager, who had been hovering nearby. "I'd like to see that special piece now." The manager disappeared into a back room and returned moments later, carrying a black velvet box significantly larger than the one containing Margaret's modest purchase. With theatrical flourish, he opened it to reveal a stunning diamond ring that captured every light in the store, sending rainbows dancing across the glass displays. Margaret gasped. The center stone was at least 3 carats, surrounded by smaller diamonds in an intricate vintage setting. It was breathtaking, and undoubtedly worth more than their mortgage. "Robert," she whispered in alarm, "what are you doing?" Before he could respond, Alexander stepped forward. "This is the ring your husband selected for you, Mrs. Ellis. A token of his appreciation for 30 years of unwavering support." Margaret's head was spinning. "But we can't afford—" "Allow me to explain," Robert interrupted gently. "After I redesigned the heating system, Mr. Reynolds approached me about joining his foundation's facilities management team. I've been offered a director position, Maggie. Triple my current salary, full benefits, and—" He paused, his eyes twinkling. "A signing bonus that made this possible." "You're leaving the hospital?" Margaret asked, struggling to process this monumental change. For 30 years, Robert had worked at Community General, climbing from janitor to maintenance supervisor, through sheer determination and night school certifications. "I gave my notice last month," Robert admitted. "I wanted everything finalized before I told you. I know how you worry." Margaret's mind raced with contradictory emotions, pride in her husband's accomplishment, excitement about their financial future, but also a strange sense of loss. Their life together had always been defined by careful budgeting and modest goals. What would they become with sudden prosperity? "The ring is beautiful," she managed, "but it's too much, Robert. It's not us." Alexander Reynolds observed them with curious interest, while Thomas tactfully busied himself with paperwork. The other sales associates, who had ignored Margaret earlier, now watched the unfolding drama with poorly disguised fascination. Robert took Margaret's hands in his. "For 30 years, you've supported every dream I've had. You worked summers to put me through technical college. You wore second-hand clothes so our kids could have new ones. You deserve this ring and so much more." "I never needed more," Margaret insisted. "Our life has been rich in all the ways that matter." A shadow of doubt crossed Robert's face. "Are you saying you don't want me to take the new position?" "No," Margaret exclaimed. "Of course I'm proud of you. It's just, everything's changing so fast." Alexander stepped forward. "Mrs. Ellis, if I may, your husband spoke of you constantly during our work together. He mentioned how you've supported countless students over your teaching career, often buying supplies with your own money. That kind of generosity deserves recognition." Margaret blushed. "That's just part of being a teacher." "It's extraordinary," Alexander corrected her, "which is why I've arranged something else." He glanced at Robert, who nodded encouragingly. My foundation is establishing a teacher grant program at your school, the Margaret Ellis Educational Fund. Each year, it will provide $50,000 for classroom materials and field trips. Margaret felt her knees weaken. Thomas quickly provided a chair, which she sank into gratefully. "This is too much," she whispered. "It's not charity," Alexander insisted. "It's an investment in exceptional educators like yourself." Robert knelt beside her chair, the magnificent ring in his hand. "Maggie, our life is changing, but we aren't. We'll still be the same people who fell in love in college, who raised our kids on potluck dinners and movie nights at home. This ring isn't about showing off. It's about finally giving you something that matches the brilliance you've brought to my life." Margaret looked from the ring to her husband's earnest face, seeing the boy she'd fallen in love with still visible in his aging features. She thought about the thousands of students she'd taught over the years, many of whom could benefit from the proposed fund. As Robert slipped the ring onto her finger, where it sat strangely heavy but undeniably beautiful, she realized this wasn't merely about jewelry. It represented a new chapter in their journey together, one where perhaps they could help others in ways they'd never imagined possible. "It's beautiful," she finally said, meaning both the ring and their unfolding future. What neither of them noticed was the calculating look that briefly crossed Alexander Reynolds' face as he watched them embrace, a look that suggested their story together was far from complete. The day after their anniversary began with a surprise. A black luxury sedan arrived at their modest suburban home to transport Margaret and Robert to a brunch in their honor. Hosted at Alexander Reynolds' downtown penthouse, the event had brought together a mixture of Reynolds' high society friends and a few of Margaret and Robert's closest acquaintances, creating an atmosphere of polite but palpable awkwardness. Margaret fidgeted with her new ring as she stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The diamond caught the sunlight and sent prisms dancing across her simple dress, the best she owned, but clearly out of place among the designer outfits surrounding her. She watched Robert across the room, engaged in animated conversation with several executives from the Reynolds Foundation. In his new suit, a gift from Alexander, he looked different, almost like a stranger. "Quite a change, isn't it?" came a soft voice beside her. Margaret turned to find a striking woman in her 60s, elegantly dressed yet with kind eyes that immediately set Margaret at ease. "Eleanor Reynolds," the woman introduced herself, extending a slender hand adorned with tasteful jewelry. "Alexander's wife. I've been looking forward to meeting you." "It's a pleasure," Margaret replied, suddenly conscious of her unmanicured hands and department store dress. "Everything is lovely." "Your home is beautiful," Eleanor smiled. "It's a showpiece, not really a home. I miss our first apartment sometimes. 600 square feet, where we actually saw each other without having to send a text message first." She nodded toward Alexander, who was introducing Robert to a prominent city councilman. "Your husband is quite impressive. Alexander speaks very highly of his skills." Margaret felt a surge of pride, but it was tempered by an uneasy feeling she couldn't quite identify. "Robert has always been talented. He can fix anything." "That's not all Alexander values," Eleanor said, lowering her voice slightly. "My husband appreciates loyalty above all else. From what he tells me, your Robert has that in abundance." Something in Eleanor's tone sent a chill down Margaret's spine. Before she could respond, Alexander appeared at their side, placing a proprietary hand on his wife's shoulder. "I see you've met Eleanor," he said to Margaret. "My better half in every way." His smile seemed warm, but Margaret noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I hope you're enjoying yourself. There are some people I'd like you both to meet." Over the next hour, Margaret found herself introduced to a bewildering array of influential figures: university deans, hospital administrators, real estate developers. With each introduction, Alexander made a point of mentioning the Margaret Ellis Educational Fund, describing it with growing embellishments until it sounded like a major philanthropic initiative rather than the modest grant program she had understood it to be. During a momentary lull, Robert pulled her into a quiet corner. "Isn't this incredible, Maggie? The connections we're making today, this could change everything for us." Margaret studied her husband's excited face. "Robert, don't you think this is all happening very fast? Just yesterday we were celebrating 30 years of our simple life, and today we're being paraded around like trophies." Robert's expression fell slightly. "Not trophies, partners. Alexander sees potential in me that Community General never recognized." He squeezed her hand. "Don't you want a chance at the life we always dreamed of? Traveling, Helping our kids with their student loans, maybe even retiring early. Margaret couldn't argue with those long-held dreams. Still, something felt wrong. What exactly will you be doing in this new position? Alexander talks about your loyalty, more than your technical skills. Before Robert could answer, they were interrupted by a tall, austere man with piercing eyes, who introduced himself as James Kendrick, Alexander's attorney. He efficiently guided them to a side room where documents awaited signatures. Just finalizing some paperwork for the fund and Robert's employment, Alexander explained smoothly. Standard procedures. Margaret scanned the documents, her educational background making her more careful than most. The language was dense with legal terminology, but certain clauses caught her attention, particularly those relating to confidentiality and loyalty considerations. When she began asking questions, Alexander deftly directed the conversation elsewhere, emphasizing the generosity of the fund and the opportunity being presented. Robert signed without hesitation, his hand steady and sure. When it was Margaret's turn to sign as a witness, she hesitated. "Something wrong?" Alexander asked, his tone light but his eyes watchful. "Just being thorough," Margaret replied, signing the papers despite her misgivings. She couldn't bear to dampen Robert's excitement, not when he looked happier than he had in years. As they left the study, Margaret excused herself to find the restroom. On her way back, she took a wrong turn and found herself in what appeared to be Alexander's home office. She was about to retreat when a framed photo on the wall caught her attention. It showed a younger Alexander standing beside Robert. Impossible, since they'd allegedly only met 6 months ago. Yet there they were, arms around each other's shoulders, standing in front of what looked like a construction site. "Lost?" Alexander's voice from the doorway made her jump. "I'm sorry, I was looking for the bathroom," Margaret stammered, pointing to the photograph. "This is confusing. You told me you only met Robert recently." Alexander stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "That's what Robert wanted you to believe." His congenial mask slipped, revealing something colder beneath. "Your husband and I have known each other for almost 20 years, Mrs. Ellis." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "That's not possible. I know everything about Robert's life." "Do you?" Alexander's smile was almost pitying now. "Robert worked on several of my development projects years ago. He has some specialized skills that proved very valuable." "What kinds of skills?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander walked to his desk, retrieving a folder which he handed to her. "See for yourself." With trembling hands, Margaret opened the folder to find newspaper clippings detailing mysterious fires at several properties that competitors had refused to sell to Reynolds Developments, properties that subsequently became available at reduced prices. Engineering reports attributed the fires to faulty electrical systems. "Robert would never," Margaret began, but memories were already surfacing. Unexplained absences, late-night phone calls, cash deposits that Robert had vaguely attributed to side jobs. "He did it all for you and the children," Alexander said quietly, "to provide the opportunities he felt you deserved." The hospital job was a cover, stable, respectable, with good benefits. Margaret's world tilted as decades of shared history suddenly realigned into a different pattern. "Why are you telling me this now? Why bring us into your life after all these years?" Alexander's expression hardened. "Because I need Robert for one last job and he was reluctant. You, Mrs. Ellis, are my insurance policy. The ring, the fund, this party, they all ensure Robert understands exactly what he stands to lose if he doesn't honor our final arrangement." "What arrangement?" Margaret demanded, her teacher's authority momentarily overriding her shock. "The community center," Alexander replied calmly. "Ironically, the same one where Robert redesigned the heating system. It's the final piece I need for a major development, but the city won't sell because of its historical status. Unless, of course, something unfortunate happens to make it uninhabitable." Margaret stared at him in horror. "You want Robert to burn down a children's community center? I'll go to the police." "With what evidence?" Alexander countered. "These old clippings. Your word against mine, and even if they believed you, Robert would still go to prison for his previous work. Is that what you want? To visit your husband behind bars every Sunday for the next 20 years? Margaret clutched the folder to her chest, her mind racing. Outside the office, she could hear the cheerful voices of guests, Robert's laugh carrying above them. A sound she had loved for 30 years. A sound belonging to a man who, she now realized, she hadn't fully known at all. Margaret stood frozen in Alexander Reynolds' office, the weight of his revelation crushing down on her. 30 years of marriage, and she had never suspected the secret her husband had kept buried beneath their ordinary life. The diamond ring on her finger now felt like a shackle rather than a gift. "You have until Monday to convince Robert," Alexander said, glancing at his watch. "The community centre will be empty over the weekend for renovations, ironically, the ones your husband recommended." "And if I refuse?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Alexander's smile was coldly professional. "Then I'll have to remind Robert of our arrangement in less pleasant ways. Your teaching career, your children's futures, even that charming little house you're so proud of, everything can disappear very quickly." The door opened and Eleanor Reynolds appeared, her gaze flicking between her husband and Margaret. "The guests are asking for you both," she said, but her eyes communicated something different to Margaret, a warning perhaps, or something like sympathy. Margaret straightened her shoulders, tucking the folder discreetly under her arm. "We'll be right there." The remainder of the party passed in a surreal haze. Margaret maintained a smile, accepted congratulations on the education fund, and watched her husband shine in his new social circle. Robert had always been charming. It was one of the things she'd first loved about him. But she had never seen him so at ease among the wealthy and powerful. How much of their life together had been genuine, and how much a carefully constructed facade. When they finally returned home that evening, Margaret sat at their kitchen table, the same one they'd bought second-hand 20 years ago, and placed the folder between them. "Tell me the truth, Robert," she said quietly. "All of it." Robert's face drained of color when he saw the clippings. He didn't ask where she'd gotten them, or try to deny anything. Instead, he sank into the chair opposite her and buried his face in his hands. "I never wanted you to know," he whispered. "It was supposed to be ancient history." 20 years is hardly ancient, Margaret countered. "Why, Robert? We weren't desperate. We were young and struggling like everyone else, but we were making it." Robert looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "You remember when Tommy needed those special tests? When the insurance wouldn't cover them? Alexander offered me a way to make quick money. I told myself it was just that one time. Abandoned buildings, insurance payouts. No one would get hurt. But it wasn't just once," Margaret said, her heart breaking as she finally understood certain unexplained aspects of their past, the sudden ability to pay medical bills, the occasional unexplained cash for college tuition. "It became easier each time," Robert admitted. "The money solved so many problems. But I stopped 15 years ago, Maggie, I swear it. After that close call with the warehouse fire, I told Alexander I was done. He let me walk away because I knew too much. The hospital job was legitimate, my way of making an honest living. Until 6 months ago," Margaret prompted. "What changed?" Robert's shoulders slumped. "He found me again. Said he needed my expertise one last time. Just consulting, nothing illegal. The community center heating system really was failing. I thought I was simply doing honest work, but now," he gestured helplessly, "he wants me to rig it to fail catastrophically. This weekend." "And you agreed?" Margaret asked, her voice rising. "I tried to refuse." "That's when the threat started." Robert leaned forward urgently. "He has evidence, Maggie. Enough to put me away for decades. And now he's using you as leverage, too. The fund, the ring, this new job, it's all about control." Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at their small, well-tended garden. For 30 years, she had prided herself on building a life based on honesty and hard work. Now she discovered that foundation had cracks she'd never seen. "We have to go to the police," she said finally. "We'll lose everything," Robert protested. "I'll go to prison." Margaret turned to face her husband. "If you do what Alexander wants, innocent children could be hurt. Our life together means nothing if it's preserved at that cost." Robert stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right. You've always been my moral compass, Maggie. I just wanted to give you the life you deserved." "I already had it," Margaret said gently. "With you." The next morning, they drove not to the police station, but to Eleanor Reynolds' private art gallery downtown. Margaret had received a text message from an unknown number. "Come alone, I can help." But she refused to keep any more secrets from Robert. Eleanor was waiting for them, elegant as ever, but with tension visible in the lines around her eyes. "You shouldn't have brought him," she said to Margaret. "We don't have secrets anymore," Margaret replied firmly. Eleanor assessed them both, then nodded. "Neither do I. That's why I've spent the last decade building a case against my husband. She withdrew a USB drive from her purse. Tax fraud, bribery, arson, extortion, it's all here meticulously documented, including evidence of how he manipulates people like Robert into doing his dirty work. "Why are you doing this?" Robert asked suspiciously. Eleanor's composed expression cracked slightly. "Because 30 years ago I was you. Young, struggling, willing to look the other way when Alexander's business ventures turned profitable too quickly. By the time I realized what I'd become complicit in, I was trapped by wealth, by fear, by shame." Margaret recognized the pain in the older woman's eyes, the same ache she had felt upon discovering Robert's secret. "This evidence," Margaret said carefully, "would it be enough to protect Robert if he cooperates with authorities?" "I've arranged immunity agreements," Eleanor confirmed. "My attorneys have been waiting for this moment for years. All we needed was someone willing to come forward, someone Alexander wouldn't suspect." Robert looked stunned. "You want us to wear wires? Record him?" "No," Eleanor replied. "I want you to go along with his plan exactly as directed, but the community center has already been quietly evacuated and the building secured. When Alexander arrives to witness his accident, federal agents will be waiting." The trap was set for Sunday evening. Robert followed Alexander's instructions precisely, while Margaret waited with Eleanor and a team of federal agents in an unmarked van nearby. Through the listening devices, they heard Alexander incriminate himself thoroughly as he directed Robert through final preparations. "Just like old times," Alexander said, clapping Robert on the shoulder. "Once this eyesore is gone, we can break ground on the high-rises by Christmas." When the agents moved in, Alexander's face registered first confusion, then betrayal as he saw Eleanor emerge from the van. His eyes found Margaret's next. "You," he spat, "the unassuming teacher. I underestimated you." "People often do," Margaret replied simply. The months that followed were difficult. Robert provided testimony in exchange for immunity, though the public scrutiny and legal proceedings took a toll on them both. Margaret returned her diamond ring to help pay for their legal expenses. Some friends drifted away, uncomfortable with the revelations about Robert's past, but others stood by them, impressed by their courage in coming forward. Margaret's school principal supported her through the media attention, and her students' parents rallied around her. Most surprisingly, Eleanor Reynolds, now in the process of divorcing Alexander, established the education fund she had promised, independently this time, with no strings attached. 1 year after the fateful anniversary party, Margaret and Robert sat in their garden, sharing a simple dinner to celebrate 31 years together. "I never thought we'd make it to this anniversary," Robert admitted, reaching for her hand across the table. "I'm still not sure why you stayed." Margaret's finger now bore her original cubic zirconia ring, a symbol not of what they lacked, but of the authentic foundation they were rebuilding. 30 years ago I promised to love you for better or worse," she replied. "We've certainly seen both, but this year has been about something more important than love." "What's that?" Robert asked. "Truth," Margaret said simply. "Without it, love is just another pretty illusion, like a diamond that turns out to be glass." Robert nodded, understanding in his eyes. "No more secrets." "No more secrets," Margaret agreed, raising her glass to toast their imperfect but honest future. Across town, the community center hummed with activity, children's laughter echoing through hallways warmed by the heating system Robert had indeed redesigned, but this time with his name proudly displayed on the dedication plaque, alongside Margaret's. Sometimes they volunteered there together, Robert teaching basic home repair skills to teenagers, while Margaret tutored younger children. Their life was simpler now, without the promise of wealth or luxury, but as they held hands across their modest table, watching the sunset paint their small garden in gold, both agreed they had never been richer.